Hey everyone, welcome back to the story. I'm so glad that you're with us today. Now, last week we ended with really this big change that happens in the history of God's people, and that is the splitting of the kingdom of Israel. Just to review, last week we saw that the 10 tribes of Israel became the northern kingdom known as Israel, led by King Jeroboam. And the southern kingdom, which became known as Judah, had the remaining 2 tribes of Israel out of the 12, and that was King Rehoboam. We said, how it could be kind of confusing with some of these old names in the Old Testament. But the point is this: both groups, both kings, had wandered far from God. They had done really terrible things in God's eyes, not only by their sin, but their flat out ignoring of God and their decision to go worship foreign gods, even after all that God had done. So that's where we pick up the story here from 1 Kings chapter 6. We see the next king of Israel that follows Jeroboam. In the 38th year of Asa, king of Judah, Ahab, son of Omri, became king of Israel. And he reigned in Samaria over Israel 22 years. Ahab, son of Omri, did more evil in the eyes of the Lord than any of those before him. That is saying something. He not only considered it trivial to commit the sins of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, but he also married Jezebel, daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Sidonians. And by that name, Ethbaal means with Baal, which is a foreign god that we're going to talk about in a moment. And began to serve Baal and worship him. He set up an altar for Baal in the temple of Baal that he built in Samaria. Ahab also made an Asherah pole and did more to arouse the anger of the Lord, the God of Israel, than did all the kings of Israel before him. Yikes. So what is going on? Obviously, things have really gone off the rails. The king of Israel is not only now kind of toying with foreign gods, but flat out worshiping them with his whole heart. More than one. Doing everything he can to pretty much ignore the God of Israel. So who are these foreign gods that he is pledging his allegiance to? Well, the couple that are mentioned here, the first is Baal, which everybody says Baal. It's usually pronounced Baal, but we'll say Baal just for sake of ease. And this can refer to many pagan gods in antiquity, but in this time it referred to a very specific weather god who brought or denied rain. And it also mentions the god Asherah. Asherah referred to the fertility god, often worshipped around Asherah poles, which were on trees or stones set up in high places. Like they go put them on the top of a mountain because they thought that the air was thinner between you and God. And that's why they often built temples on top of mountains, because they felt like it was closer to God. And so we have these 2 pagan gods, the king of Israel, flat out worshiping these 2 without a mention of the God who brought them this far. And we as the reader, we read this and we think, how could they have ever forgotten God? How is that even possible? After all that God did, bringing them out of Egypt, out of slavery, rescuing them even from themselves and through the wilderness and crossing into the promised land and all the things, how could they ever forget God after all that he had done? I think it's a great question. I remember in my life there was a time when I prayed really hard that God would show up for something. It's actually when I was in my mid-20s, I was praying that I would be married and have a family. And honestly, I thought it would never happen for me. I had kind of given up. It's so funny to think back and think in my mid-20s I'd already given up. But really, I was done. I thought it would never happen. And it was through this crazy sequence of events that I met Karen on a mission trip that I almost didn't go on. Even days before, I had decided the last minute to go ahead and go on the trip. And there are all these really wonderful moments that kind of created this moment when Karen and I met. And I think back at that time and I think, wow, God really delivered me a promise that I never saw coming. And he delivered it in a pretty miraculous way. It's like if everything if the universe just didn't line up just so, it may not have happened. I saw God in that. And that was something I would often go back to remember God's goodness. But listen, that was half a lifetime ago. I come into situations now, and oftentimes I forget the miracles that God has worked in my own life because I'm waiting on the next crisis, or I'm trying to figure out the next issue that needs to be solved. But if I think about it, maybe I can't be so hard on the Israelites. How could I ever forget God after all that he has done for me? Why does that happen? Why do you and I and the ancient Israelites, why do we forget God so quickly? Well, probably it's just to do with the stuff of life, and the thing that's right in front of us is the thing that's most urgent. It also happens when I think we're trying to look for a quick fix. We have a problem, we have an issue, we have something that we're waiting on, and we want it done now because we hate waiting. We want to take control. We were told from when we were little, right? God helps those who help themselves, right? That is nowhere in the Bible, but it's something that we all learn. It's like picking yourself up by your own bootstraps. You're the master of your domain. You are the ones going to make it happen. Just do it. Get out there. And what happens is, I think we put more trust in ourselves, in whatever looks like the faster answer, than waiting upon God, because we don't know what God's timetable is. And oftentimes he makes us wait, and we don't know what to do with that anyway. It's kind of like when I had a flat tire and I tried to use a Fix-A-Flat can. You ever try one of those? I know some people swear by them. They say they work great. This thing didn't work at all. So I had a flat tire. I had the Fix-A-Flat. It was in the emergency kit in the car, and I go to fill up the tire, and it was like, I swear, I could have had like a dog breathing into the nozzle. It would have been better than that. It's like nothing happened. I was so frustrated. I'm like, why do we even put this in a car? And listen, even if it did work, it doesn't actually fix the real problem. It's a temporary solution, but it's not fixing the real need for the new tire. I can get by for a while, but maybe that's a little bit like us and Jesus. Many people come to Jesus looking for a quick fix. Say, listen, I don't know everything about Jesus. Just give me the Cliff Notes on Jesus. Give me the Cliff Notes so that I can, he could be my lucky talisman. I could do the lucky prayer and give me the lucky rock to hold, and he's going to get me out of this situation. Give me just enough to help, but not so much that you start making me uncomfortable. Here's the problem with all of that. If we treat Jesus like a commodity, we miss it. And if we're not careful, we're going to miss God's actual remedy for our needs while we're trying to chase after a quick fix that doesn't solve the problem anyway. So what did that mean for God's people in the time of Ahab? Well, the remedy was that God would deliver his promise, he would deliver his truth through his prophets. Now, we've seen prophets before already in the nation of Israel. A prophet would come up and they would be the voice of God, the course corrector for the king. But as we see now in this moment, the kings have gotten so bad, we see the drama factor go way up when it comes to prophets. In fact, it's such a dire situation. God uses these prophets not just to speak his word, but they actually demonstrate acts of God's power. And I think it's because things are so bad, he needs to get their attention. He needs to prove to them that he is more powerful than any quick fix God they're trying to chase after. Prophets are God's messengers to his lost people. And today we see the prophet Elijah. Elijah, perhaps the most famous prophet in the Old Testament, really because of his acts of power. His name means my God is Yahweh. I mean, how straight up is that, right? So you had that king Ethbaal, who means I am with Baal, and you have Elijah rise up, and his name literally means I'm with the God of Israel. My God is Yahweh. And through his ministry, we see these miraculous displays of God's power. He tells King Ahab, it's not going to rain for 3.5 years. You go ahead and pray to your weather god. It's not going to work. We see him provide food miraculously for a widow and her son. Right? Even Elijah himself is given food by the Lord miraculously. We see at one point when the widow's son dies, Elijah uses the power of God to resurrect the widow's son. Mount Carmel, there's this big showdown with 450 prophets of Baal and Elijah. And it was a challenge. It said, okay, whichever God starts the fire on each of these altars is the one true God. And it's a really wonderful scene where, the prophets of Baal, they're trying so hard to get Baal to rain down fire on the altar. It doesn't work, and Elijah starts taunting them, which is awesome, by the way. And then when it's Elijah's turn, the prophets of Baal say, no, just in case the wood's too dry, let's douse it. So they doused it in water just to make sure, but it didn't matter. Elijah calls upon the one true God, and it lights the altar on fire. He even later meets with God himself on the top of Mount Sinai, where he famously hears the gentle whisper. It's miraculous. It's crazy. There's all this legend about Elijah because he got to experience the power of God in a way that other prophets had not. And it was all to do what? To turn people back, to remind them where the real remedy was, that the power of God is greater than the power of these false gods or the power of the world. Then when Elijah's ministry nears its end, he looks to pass the torch to someone else named Elisha. So let's go to 1 Kings chapter 19. So Elijah went from there and found Elisha, son of Shaphat. He was plowing with 12 yoke of oxen, and he himself was driving the 12th pair. Elijah went up to him and threw his cloak around him. This was a sign of a passing of the torch. You've heard the phrase picking up your mantle. This is what that is. It's a transfer of the mantle, transfer of the responsibility of prophet of God from one to another. So Elisha left him and went back. He took his yoke of oxen and slaughtered them. He burned the plowing equipment to cook the meat and gave it to the people, and they ate. Then he set out to follow Elijah and become his servant. In other words, he was all in. He left everything behind to be the prophet, the next prophet of God. Then something strange happens as their ministry reaches a conclusion, at least Elijah's does, toward the end of his ministry, when the real handoff happens is in 2 Kings chapter 2. Check out this moment. This is awesome. As they were walking along and talking together, suddenly a chariot of fire and horses of fire appeared and separated the two of them, and Elijah went up to heaven in a whirlwind. I would love to see this done well in Hollywood special effects. This is crazy. This is such a crazy moment. Elijah, there's all this legend about Elijah. Elijah was the only one who didn't die before he's whisked away to heaven. Now you could say, well, did that mean he was dying? I have no idea. I just know he was taken away to heaven. Interestingly, later with Jesus, that's what people thought he was the second coming of Elijah, which is interesting. So in that moment where he asks, who do they say that I am? He says, some people say you're Elijah. Well, that's where that comes from. There's all this legend that Elijah was going to come back. But what was this chariot of fire all about? It was about the power of God is greater than the power of the world. So don't forget God. Remember what he has done. Remember that the power that is in you is greater than the power that is in the world. This is the fundamental message of the prophets of God, to show where the real power to change your life, lies. So let's look at Elisha. Very similarly, his name has significance. His name means my God is salvation. He also shows miraculous displays of God's power as the continuation of Elijah's ministry. He actually heals the water at Jericho, and there's all sorts of symbolism there, right? But the wells had gone bad, and he healed the water. He used God's power for, again, another miraculous provision of food, where he fed a company of prophets. He also resurrected a Shunammite woman's son. So we see all of these things very similar between Elijah and Elisha. I think what's going on here is we're getting a preview of things to come. We're understanding how God works, who he is, what his power is like, so that we could recognize him when he comes in Jesus Christ. Elijah and Elisha. My God is Yahweh, my God is salvation. They both demonstrate what? God's power over creation, God's supernatural power. They also show about how God gives life and resurrection to only sons. That's a preview of things to come. But the whole point is this, to turn the hearts of God's people back, to say, look, these quick fix remedies you've been chasing are no good. Come back to the one who's going to make you whole. Come back to what was said in the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. It occurred to me as I was going through this story, there's a lot of fire. What's that about? In fact, that moment when Elijah hears the gentle whisper of God, he's actually expecting God to show up in a fire. I think there's a lot of symbolism in fire, isn't there? Of course, it's power, it's intimidating, it's scary. But I think the biggest thing that fire does when it naturally occurs is it gives life to dead ecosystems. And this ecosystem of the nation of Israel, and the kingdom of Judah, it was dead. This is what the prophet Amos says. Prophet Amos says in chapter 3, verses 1 and 2, hear this word, people of Israel. The word the Lord has spoken against you, against the whole family I brought up out of Egypt. You only have I chosen of all the families of the earth. Therefore I will punish you for all your sins. Things had just gotten so bad that he needed to take care of the sin problem if his people were going to continue. He needed to remedy their sin brokenness. And the only way that he could do it was to get them to turn back to him. There's this moment when the king of Aram sends forces to destroy Elisha. If you look at the map there, you see Aram is up there just north of the kingdom of Israel. So that king comes to get rid of Elisha. And here's how that unfolds in 2 Kings chapter 6. Then he sent horses and chariots and a strong force there. They went by night and surrounded the city. When the servant of the man of God got up and went out early the next morning, an army with horses and chariots had surrounded the city. Oh no, my lord, what shall we do? The servant asked. Don't be afraid, the prophet answered. Those who are with us are more than those who are with them. And Elisha prayed, open his eyes, Lord, so that he may see. Then the Lord opened the servant's eyes, and he looked and saw the hills full of horses and chariots of fire all around Elisha. There it is. More chariots of fire. Again, the power of God that we can't always see is there all the time. We just have to believe it's there. The power of God that's greater than anything this world can muster. The power of God is greater than the power of this world. Listen, there's no quick fix to the needs of life. Only the lifelong process of following Jesus. But more than that, we're not only called to remember what God has done, to remember that power in our own lives, we're also called to help others know that power. 2 Corinthians 5 puts it this way. We are therefore Christ's ambassadors, as though God were making his appeal through us. We implore you on Christ's behalf, be reconciled to God. Don't forget what he has done. Make sure everybody else knows what he has done too. We are God's messengers. We actually now, as believers in Jesus, who are filled by the Holy Spirit, we take on the mantle of the prophets. We show the power of God and how it works in everyday life. How? By being faithful, by trusting, by knowing that those chariots of fire are on the mountain with us, even if we can't see them. Speaking of chariots of fire, when I saw that movie when I was a kid, my dad and I went to see the movie. I was fully expecting like a gladiator movie. I had no idea that it was about running. I was very disappointed. Years later, I would really appreciate this movie because it's such a wonderful faith film. It's all set around the 1924 Paris Olympics, and Eric Liddell, who's a son of Scottish missionaries, athlete for the British, and he decides he's not going to run on Sunday. And this was a huge deal. This was a huge thing. He wasn't going to do it on the Lord's Day because they felt it wasn't right. He took a stand. He did everything he could to share where life's real remedies, real meaning, real hope, real glory lie. Not in the Olympic Games, but in the Almighty God. He later became a missionary to China, where he served many years as a faithful man of God. And his whole story, and the story of that film, is the same as what we've been talking about today. The power of God is greater than the power of this world, and we must never forget what he's done for us so that we can trust in what he's going to do tomorrow. This is a chapter in your story. Have a great week, everyone.